All right, good morning, everybody. It's time to get started. As the syllabus indicates and the first slide here, we'll not have a Zoom class meeting, so you'll be spending that time doing the midterm exam. And I will put that on D2L, shortly before class time starts, and then you have until the end of class to finish the exam. So it should be manageable, short enough, or it'll be appropriate for that amount of time. And you can use a page of your notes during the exam, but otherwise it's closed book, closed notes, except for the page of notes that you make for the exam. And today we'll start with just an overview, summary, short discussion of the Cordy and Gillespie article that was assigned for today, and then we'll do some review for the midterm exam. So have you got questions about that stuff? Okay, so if you do, just let me know. And let's see here. Get this up. So like I said last time, we're not going to go into small groups in a way to save a little bit of time to get to some review. And so Wendy and Morgan were the grad students assigned for the discussion leaders. So we talked a little bit about it, Wendy and Morgan and I, what would happen. So, but I didn't say what I'll do is I'll just start talking about what I find interesting about the article, and when there's gaps or spaces, the two of you or anybody else can just jump in and ask a question or make a comment or ask to clarify what it is that I'm talking about. And yeah, hopefully that'll work. Hopefully there'll be some edification. So hopefully, one thing that you noted right at the beginning of the article, are you seeing the article on your screen now? Am I sharing that? Okay. So that in the abstract of an academic article, usually you see the main point and even the results of the study. So right here, results showed. But before we get into those kinds of details, I guess I want to put this into a little context. So the article is about two main principles in conversation analysis: repair and intersubjectivity. And the researchers' interest was to see how this works. The idea of repair and intersubjectivity, how that works when a person is interacting with a non-human agent and with various levels of awareness of to what degree the agent is non-human. So the findings in general, that the interactant, that's the person, the human person who's the research subject, is less likely to initiate repairs. When the interlocutor, that's the person they're speaking to, communicates via the text screen, or when the interlocutor is known to be using words that are, machine generated. So the basic finding was that if a human is interacting with something that they know to be non-human, they are less likely to get particular kinds of repairs, like other initiated repairs. And this has implications for all kinds of things, just philosophically, like people thinking about what it means to communicate and use language, but it also has practical application to what kinds of artificial intelligent agents we can expect to interact with in a meaningful way. At least that's what it means to me. So a couple other big things. We talked a little bit about EDIC and EMIC research, and that what you all are doing with your papers this term will be an EMIC approach. That is, you're trying to get at the insider's perspective on the data. This is a so-called EDIC normative approach, this particular study. So what you saw, let's see, scroll down here a little bit. So when a research study has hypotheses, explicitly stated hypotheses, it will be what's known as a normative EDIC kind of research study. Now, you can have an EMIC study and you can have questions that guide you through the research, like why is it that you're doing the study? You should always start with some kind of question, but in an EDIC study, these are stated formally and they have 4 hypotheses. So one issue that raises, and they mention it a little bit, is the idea of counting up things. So in an EDIC normative perspective, you control variables. And in this study, they controlled variables. They decided they were going to count up other initiated repair, and they were going to count up self-repair behavior. So those are things that they could identify in transcripts and then count them up. So a problem, and what's controversial about that, is the idea that in conversation analysis, you are supposed to be relying on the participants' interpretation of what's going on, not the analyst's interpretation. So when you start counting things up, automatically the people who are interacting, their perspective kind of goes away and things get reduced to just numbers. So a lot of linguistic research and discourse analytic research does do this, isolate variables and count them up. With some things, it's a lot easier to imagine doing it. So for example, there's research on interaction that counts up things like discourse markers, something like now or so or well. And those things are easier to count up because they're just these discrete linguistic items. You know, you can identify the word well in a transcript and count it up. And it's not controversial to count those things up. But when it comes to identifying something like other initiated, other repair, and then to count them all up, the suggestion is that they're all the same, just because they're other initiated, other repair. So that is controversial in conversation analysis. There are people who like to count things up and they think that's appropriate to do that. And there are others who would say it doesn't make any sense to do that. So I've suggested to a number of you who have written about your own papers that you don't have to worry about doing a kind of quantitative analysis. However, if you are seeing similar things happening repeatedly, and you do feel like they're the same thing, or they are things that you can kind of make a collection of, that is appropriate. I just don't want you to, for your papers, I don't want you to try to rely on a statistical analysis or statistical argumentation. I want you to look at the participants' behavior and see how they're interpreting what's going on. So yeah, so this is definitely an EDIC approach, quantitative, normative, EDIC approach. They have hypotheses, and they controlled the situation as carefully as they could. They discussed some of the limitations of doing that control. Like, how is it that you can ensure that the participants, each of the research subjects, is going to be getting a similar interaction with either the text bot or the echo Borg, the human being who's uttering machine-generated language. It's very difficult to control for those situations. So they did what is standard in discourse analytic research. They identified all these examples of repair, and they counted them up, and they did a statistical analysis. And then the findings were that as they hypothesized, at least two of the hypotheses were supported, that they expected that it makes a difference when a human speaker interacts with a text, with text on a screen, or if they're interacting with a human that looks like a human and was in fact a human, but was uttering language that was produced by a machine. And so when the participants knew they were interacting with a human who was uttering words produced by a machine, that human interlocutor, research subject, was less likely to act like a human, I guess is one way to put it. So what else can we say about this? Or what questions have you got about the study? Excuse me.
I had a question about the 3-turn sequence they described for repair for misunderstandings. Is that universal, or is that just English?
Let's see, like something like this. Let's see.
Yeah, there was a really basic way they described it in the beginning of the article before they actually got into the hypothesis and the study. But just those basic 3 turns.
Yeah, I don't know about that. Like the language that I indicated they were using, like from this direct perspective and meta perspective and meta perspective. I don't know how universal that is, because that comes from a tradition that I'm not familiar with, psychology or maybe psycholinguistics. But this idea of, then they get into repair that we've talked about, and this idea, this is purported to be universal or not specific to the English language, that somebody produces a trouble source, that then can be a repair initiation, and then there can be a repair. Now I'm saying there can be a repair initiation and a repair separately, but we've seen examples where there isn't an explicit repair initiation. Somebody just makes the repair. It's like doing a correction. You can do that too. But this idea of repair is purported to be universal. But as any linguist or conversation analyst would say, it's still an empirical question, because not every not every human language has been described that way.
Thank you.
There is a question in the chat from Sequoia. And she was talking about how the idea of repair after next turn is similar to an adjacency pair, except you have these 3 steps. So would that be an adjacency triplet is the question.
That's a good question. So I think the best way to think about repair with respect to adjacency pairs is that repairs are, think of it this way. So an adjacency pair is something that people use in a way as shortcuts in their interaction. So you do them to get particular work done. So if I want somebody to shut the door, I might say, could you please shut the door? And I'm going to get there's an expected response to that. Like the person's going to say, yes, I'll shut the door, and they shut the door, or they don't. And that's the main action, because it's about somebody wanting the door shut. But repair, that's about solving or making sure that the main action happens. So when somebody does a first turn like this, I took the subway, that's the second part of a adjacency pair. How did you get to work? I took the subway, question, answer. And then after that, there's, you took the subway. So these two things, they do look like a pair, because you took the subway is a response to this, I took the subway. They're questioning it somehow. So those things are related, but they're different. It's different from an adjacency pair, because an adjacency pair is something kind of like like we say a clause. Languages have clauses, languages have adjacency pairs. And when somebody produces the first part of an adjacency pair, you would expect the second part to happen after the first part. But with a repair, you never really know where that's going to happen. So it makes sense to analyze repair as part of, connected to some adjacency pair, but I just wouldn't call it, don't mix it up with something like an adjacency pair, that it's something like an adjacency pair. I hope that answers the question.
I have a question. It was about continuation. Will that just be when we are completely ignoring the other person and we're just changing subjects on it, or is it because the other person will just be completely hard of hearing?
Say the first part again. What the first part was?
Continuation, when they get the results or we're then explaining the study. I believe there's a part where they have C for continuation.
I'm not, yeah, do you know where that is? Because I'm not sure what that means.
I believe it's like when they're doing their study.
Well, here it is right here, continuation. Yeah, oh, that's a, yeah. So this term, the let it pass strategy, is one that other researchers have discussed. And it could happen for all kinds of reasons. So for example, like on a Zoom call, it probably happens a lot. Somebody says something and the other person doesn't hear it. And they say, what? And then they try it again and they still don't get it. And then maybe after 2 times, somebody just decides, okay, it's really not that important. Let's just move on. So there isn't any, there's like a try for a repair, but the repair itself may not ever happen. Another example of this continuation or let it pass strategy is somebody may say something that is, let's say, grammatically disfluent, or somebody would say non-standard or something like that. In some circumstances, somebody's going to repair the non-standard language. They're going to correct the person. But in other situations, they wouldn't. And you could say, well, okay, it seems like they've just let it pass. That's not important to stop the interaction at that point and work it out. So in these examples of people with aphasia or hearing loss or things like that, that happens quite a bit, because you can't spend a lot of time, or it doesn't make sense to spend a lot of time doing repair work if it's not productive, if you're not going to get anywhere with it. So those are exceptions, and there's like they talked about in their article, like there's a baseline of interaction. They are suggesting there's this baseline for interaction that they're using to see how humans interact with machines. And the baseline is that if somebody produces a trouble source, there should be some repair done, and then they move on with the progressivity. And if it doesn't happen, then you have to ask, why didn't it happen? What's going on? There's some other kind of interactional work happening. So were there other questions or comments?
I had a question, but it's a little further back in the reading.
Yeah.
When they were describing the background of the participants, they only described like the female members.
Really?
At least I didn't catch them describing any of the male members,
I
because
think that was their way of describing which was the majority of
Yeah, so they didn't really describe anybody other than to say how many participants and how many of those participants identified as female. That's what I remember.
Because I was just confused, because it said like there was 69 females and the average age was like 25 something, and I took that as the average age of the females and not all the participants. And so I
think that probably means average age for all the participants.
Okay. Yeah, because that was confusing. I was like, why only only the females?
Yeah. So there's a good question. So why in a study like this do they identify how many males, how many females, and their average age? But in a conversation analysis study, you don't report those things usually.
Is it because different? I guess that's kind of sexist. I was gonna say maybe different genders communicate different ways, or there's different like communication styles between people that are older and people that are younger.
Well, that's the assumption made in an EDIC study like this, that there should be some sort of balance, or there should be some sort of awareness of how old people are. But in a conversation analytic study, the starting point is that people are doing work to maintain intersubjectivity, and regardless of their ages or gender, they have to do that work. So it's up to the participants to make those identities relevant to their interaction, if it is relevant to their interaction. That would be the conversation analytic perspective. Because in this study, they don't do anything with the fact that there were X number of people who identified as women and X number of people who had other identification. That's not mentioned again. It's just put in there because they are, accustomed to having some kind of balance between participants to suggest that it's generalizable to the population as a whole.
So then what would an emic approach to this kind of research look like?
That's a great question. I mean, I would really be interested in working on a study like this because I would want to know what happens with these controlled groups and how controlled are they really, and what does it look like when they actually interact. So one thing is, if I look at a transcript excerpt like this, I don't see a lot of detail there. And the ones that came up later, when they showed that the human research subject wasn't really trying very hard to make repairs, I wanted to know what that sounded like. I wanted to see some more detail and see how is it that somebody does, like, giving a half-hearted effort at interacting with the machine. That's what I would be interested in looking at. So the actual instances and the actual processes of doing the interaction. That would
It's
be
also, sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I don't know if they said how long the interactions were, but I would be curious about whether there was sort of initially earlier on in the interactions some attempts to use other initiated repair, and then very quickly I would expect that the participant would give up. When you look at the excerpts that are kind of showing that the bot is just, it looks like they're just generating very random utterances.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if I were interacting in that kind of situation, after maybe 1 or 2 attempts to clarify things, I would just kind of give up. And so, yeah, I was curious about that as well.
Yeah, and there are some researchers who do conversation analysis and they work on questions just like that, because what they're trying to do is help the people who are programming the machines to make it more realistic. So they look at what does a human interact and do when the bot does something really unusual, and then how do they move out of that? Like, how do they work their way out of it? So that's important for the person designing the machine to know what to do next if the machine produces something that seems ridiculous, and to recognize the response by the human to know how to continue to move on. So that all has to be done in an emic way, like a real step-by-step way, to see how individual cases work.
Yeah, I had a similar question about how, because like the way that they've written it, there was this one, what's your favorite game? He is legend. He is legend. Is that a game? Yes, you are. I'm a game. I'm a cat. It's like they did sort of attempt to repair that several times, but the chatbot just wasn't having it. It just like almost trying to get it off course. I was wondering if it's really the interactant that's like not responding to the robot as a human, or if they're actually just responding to them as an uncooperative separate interactant.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question, and maybe they should have combined this with some interviews of the of the research subjects too, to ask them, like, what were you doing when you were interacting with these things, or what were you thinking? Because I think that's a really hard question to know just by looking at these little interactions. Like, what, you can see when they failed or gave up, but you don't know exactly why. And sometimes you don't know exactly why the bot responded in a certain way, if it was because of bad programming, or it didn't hear, it didn't pick up what the human was saying. So we don't know that either.
I'd be interested to see if there was a more like close response from the chatbot, if the interactant would have more benchmark intersubjectivity, to use the text.
Can you repeat that again, because my dog was just barking frantically?
Oh yeah, I was wondering if the chatbot was more close to creating a dialogue that seemed natural, if the interactant would treat it with some more benchmark intersubjectivity.
I think the assumption is that the human interactant was usually treating it with benchmark attempts at intersubjectivity. I guess that was the assumption, that if it's a human research subject, they're gonna normally act like a human. And then the researchers wanted to find out, are we seeing behavior that looks human-like? And it turns out they didn't, when the research subjects knew that what they were interacting with was a machine.
Yeah, I was just wondering if the machine was more like a human, like if the responses weren't like, I'm a cat, if they would treat it more human-like.
I guess, but it's only as good as, they can program a machine to be like a human, I guess. And different programs work better than others. So yeah, they didn't go into that, how reliable these bots were at producing human-like interaction.
Yeah, and if you put an Android up there and switched it, and instead of having a human with Android responses, have an Android that's just a human is speaking through it, but you're telling them that it's just the Android.
Yeah. I think they cited at least one study like that. So people are thinking about that question too, like reversing the situation a little bit. So I want to stop because I want to get to some review time. So hopefully that will work. Thanks. Let's see. Okay, so just to put things, starting big and working down to details. So I want you just to think of your own definition of pragmatics, but this is the way that these are three ways of saying more or less the same thing. So when I say analysis of conventions for language use in context, that's a mouthful, but it's just trying to get at ideas of what kind of formats do people use when they use language to account for the context that it's used in. So you could also say, some people would call conventions for language use, some people would call that the grammar of language use. So if that makes more sense to you, some people would just shorten this and just say the analysis of situated language use. So language use appropriate to a particular situation. So that's what pragmatics is. And then we started talking about theories, which are attempts to explain the way language use works. And now we're moving into what are analytic methods used to uncover and analyze language use. This real science versus practice science is what I want to suggest, that what I'm trying to attempt to do in this class is to have you all be producing, real science versus practice science. So the real science aspect of it is that you're discovering something in your data that you were not instructed to discover by an instructor. So we're not doing a practice kind of experiment here, like mix these two things together and I'll show you what comes out of it. I don't know what's going to come out of what your data is. So you're doing these analytic practices to understand what happened in your interaction with respect to pragmatics. So the theory part that we discussed pretty briefly for all of these things was the linguistic sign and the difference between the Saussurian and the Peircean linguistic sign, and how from my perspective, the Peircean linguistic sign makes more sense to think about language use because there's this interpretant involved in the Peircean linguistic sign, and that part is absent from the Saussurian linguistic sign. So the three-part triangle of having a representamen, an object, and an interpretant seems to capture the perspective that there are human agents using language and interpreting language at every step of the way. So then we talked about Austin and Searle, who made the first formulations about that language is used often for action, that there's some kind of action done via language. And sometimes it's done very explicitly with performative verbs, like I pronounce you spouse and spouse. The actual verb pronounce has some sort of meaning. But in speech act theory, and what we've discovered since then, is that people do social actions and they accomplish social actions all the time without using explicit performative verbs. Like, I can ask somebody to close the door and I don't have to say, I hereby ask you to close the door. This is a formal request. I'm requesting you to close the door. You can just say close the door and it's understood as a request. So there doesn't have to be a performative verb used. So in speech act theory, Searle came up with these 5 types of speech acts. So, a theory that says all language can fit into one of these 5 speech acts: directives, assertives, commissives, declaratives, expressives. And then when we assigned things to speech acts, we saw that context is very necessary to really understand what kind of an action is being done by an utterance. And then I talked about these ideas of there's just the basic semantics of an utterance, the locution, but then there's an illocutionary force in it. So when somebody produces a speech act, they have a particular intention. There's that particular force behind it. Like they intend this action to occur in a particular way. But that doesn't happen always. There's a perlocutionary effect. So the effect, sorry, I should have said, the effect does often align with the intent, the illocutionary force. So that's like the seamless turn-by-turn interaction. Somebody has a particular intention, they say something, the other person understands it the way that the first person said it, and that's the perlocutionary effect, and then they move on. That's the unproblematic, in a way you could call it, cooperative nature of language. So that's what the cooperative principle was proposing, that we use language the way we use it, and we get by using the language the way we use it because the baseline assumption that we have when you speak with somebody is these cooperative aspects of the cooperative principle, which Grice outlined in the Gricean maxims, that you speak in a relevant way, you speak in a clear way, you speak in a truthful way, and you say no more or no less than you need. And that's just the default. So our basic interaction just works like that because we put that into practice because we've been brought up that way. It's just we're socialized that way. And you can play around with the maxims, flout them for humorous effect, or you can flout them just because people, play with language. But it's flouting maxims is not anything out of the ordinary. It's an everyday language practice. So the implicature aspect of this, so implicature is just that people mean much more than what is, let's say, literally or semantically uttered. And we are able to interpret the more that people are intending because we know about Grice's maxims. So we know that there are certain things implied if somebody is producing more language than is necessary, or there's certain things implied if somebody produces less, or if they produce something that's not relevant. If they just jump to something completely irrelevant, there's something is going on, and that's the implicature. Something else is implied that's not directly stated. And then politeness theory is another major theory in pragmatics, the idea that people are protecting positive and negative face, and that we, and as we discussed, it seems like for a lot of people, us in our class at least, it's a better idea maybe to think about it like rather than positive and negative, to think about like pro-social, preserving social bonds and social relationships versus protecting privacy. That's all the positive and negative is intended to mean. And you use certain language formulations when you are doing politeness strategies to either protect your social bonds with people, or to protect your own privacy, or to protect the other person's privacy. Okay, so that's the theoretical aspect. And then, as you discovered, putting things into the boxes of theory is sometimes difficult because things don't always fit so neatly. And then a method for trying to understand action on a more detailed level is conversation analysis, and that's what we've been working on for the last 2 or 3 weeks. And the feature of conversation analysis is you have very detailed transcriptions. You have data that you collected that were not elicited. So we're not collecting the data for purposes to understand repair, like in the last study, the Corti and Gillespie. They collected data, they were looking for repair. In conversation, pure conversation analysis, you just collect some data, you transcribe it in detail, then you look for particular actions and you see what comes out of it of interest. So you have these detailed transcriptions, and just like we did with speech acts, no, not just like, but you start by identifying actions that are happening. And speech act theory had these 5 types, but we can break these down into much more detail, and we can use our own members' intuition because we're members of the language culture. So we know what these actions are because we use them ourselves. So some of these are very familiar to us, like apologizing or offering or warning or inviting or complaining. These are kinds of actions that people do with language. Suggesting. these other things, okay, assessment, that might be unfamiliar to you or you haven't used that word in, but that's used a lot in conversation analysis. And it just means like somebody offering their opinion or evaluating. So evaluative kind of language. That tastes great, you know, or it's a beautiful day, or, you know, those are the more obvious examples of assessments. So when you think of an assessment, think of like evaluative kind of behavior. We talked about question answer as an adjacency pair. Sometimes it's important, you want to break down like what kind of question it is. Is somebody seeking information or are they doing something else? So question is often seen as a kind of general grammatical category, and there may be different kinds of actions going on with the question, like whether somebody is they're eliciting an assessment, or they're eliciting information, or they're, you know, like teachers ask questions all the time where they're not really seeking information. They know what the answer is. They want to, what they're doing is trying to elicit a display of student knowledge. You know, so that's why, you know, question answer is a nice shorthand for an adjacency pair, but questions themselves have different kinds of grammatical questions have different kinds of actions sometimes. So you kind of want to think about breaking those down. So these are some kinds of actions that we can identify in the conversation, but there are countless others. This is just a short list. So you may see something happening in your own data and you want to say, this person seems to be doing this kind of action, and you can come up with a name for it, you know, if there isn't another name for it. And then the ideal is you try to show what the participants are seeing it as that kind of action, not just you, but the participants. So you do that, you try to get the participants' perspective by describing the turn construction, like, okay, there are two clauses in there, and there's some hesitation or pause, there's laughter, rising intonation at the end. That's all important to understanding what kind of action is being done. It helps you make your case. If you say in line 3, you know, this person's doing an apology, and sometimes describing the turn construction will help you make the case that yes, indeed, it is an apology. So yeah, so we identify actions and then turns and then sequences of turns in those actions. So we start with a pair, an adjacency pair, you know, invitation and acceptance. That's a basic adjacency pair. And then there are longer sequences that get built around those adjacency pairs. And we talked about that previously with the pre-sequence, pre-invitations. And then insert, like repair sequences that happen between main adjacency pairs, and then things that happen after adjacency pairs. Okay, so what questions have you got at this point about this short summary of the first 5 weeks of the term?
As a quick question about the midterm, it's mostly written responses, yes?
Yeah, they will be all written responses.
Thank you.
Okay. So that's good, I guess that's clear. So let's then see some examples of what I was just talking about. So this came from the Shegloff reading. So the idea is that a speech act theory might make a claim that what's happening here when M says, do you know who's going to the meeting? That this thing is something like a directive, meaning tell me who's going to the meeting. That is one interpretation from speech act theory. And Shegloff suggested that's the primary classification that speech act theory would say about this utterance. Do you know who's going to the meeting? But then as we saw, the response is that R hears it differently. R does not respond to this as a directive, who is going to the meeting, because R doesn't say who's going to the meeting. R says who. So speech act theory doesn't have a way to deal with this because it didn't deal with sequences of utterances. It was just one thing at a time. So what this is telling us is that R is interpreting what M says as a kind of pre-announcement. So R hears it as a pre-announcement because R says who, like tell me who. And then we see that M says, I don't know. And then R says probably, then R gives the information. So R gives the information down here, but not in line 3, because that's not how R was interpreting it. So one way to think about this in terms of sequences is here you have a first pair part, that's what the FPP is, the first pair part. And then a second pair part is who. Well, the second pair part then itself turns into an initiation of repair. So there's this who becomes a first, like who, and then M responds, I don't know who. So there's the second pair part. And then R says, oh, probably Mrs. Owens. So this becomes the second part of this first part of the adjacency pair. Do you know who's going? Oh, probably Mrs. Owens. So this is a way to think about it in sequential terms. Like one thing is responding to or connected to another term. So again, in speech act theory, what happens is the analyst looks through the data and says, this is what's happening. And the data are often intuitive, like people coming up with sentences, or just single utterances without context. And here, by having the context, you can see how the participants are interpreting one another's language. And that at this time, lines 1 and 2, the action turns out to be an actual directive. Tell me who's going to the meeting. So, but it didn't turn out to be that until line 5. They had to work that out. Okay, so this one other important aspect for doing our analysis is this idea of preference, which is like normativity or regularity, so that we expect certain second, let's put it this way, after the first part of an adjacency pair, it's recognized as the first part of an adjacency pair, and there's an expected second part to it. So if the first part is a summons, hey, John, summons, the expected second part is a response to the summons. What? That's all that means. That's like that's the way interaction usually goes. Similarly with repair, there's a preference for the self, the person who produces the trouble source. The preference is for that person to do the repair. So preference doesn't mean that it has to happen that way. It's just that it usually happens that way. And then in your own data, if you see things that are not happening that way, that people aren't producing the preferred responses or the preferred repair trajectories, that's something that becomes an analytic point then. You can then ask yourself, why is this happening? Why are people producing dispreferred responses? Yeah. I mean, this is just an illustration of how the preference for self repair is supposed to work. So A says it's just about 3 o'clock, so she's probably free. I'll call her now. What time is it? 3, isn't it? I thought it was earlier. Oh, 2, sorry. So you see that there's a trouble source produced and in the very first line, 3 o'clock. And then B points to there being some trouble source by starting a repair. What time is it? And the person responds 3. And then B again says, oh, I thought it was earlier. And then A says 2. So it's the self who eventually produces the repair. But what so B doesn't just do an outright other repair or outright other correction. It seems to be delayed. And what you can say about this is that this suggests or shows the preference for self-repair. Now, we don't know what's in B's head. B may not have known at all that it was an error. Maybe it was an error of hearing, but the fact that it happens a couple times and that B here makes a suggestion and then A does the repair is an illustration of the preference for self-repair. Do that tonight. Okay. 12, we have 8 minutes. Okay, we won't be able to do this in groups either. So let's just do this together. This is I sent this to you by email, but I'll just send it in a chat. There's just one excerpt that we're going to look at here. Okay, so what I want to do with just this, it's this excerpt. And what I want to say here too is maybe to reassure you a little bit. This is actually a kind of a simplified transcript excerpt by Gail Jefferson, but it's still kind of hard to read. And sometimes with the weird spelling conventions, things are hard to read too. I changed some of those to make it a little easier. So just so you know, on the midterm exam, I'll try to make the spelling conventions easier so you can actually kind of get an idea in your head what people are saying and how they're saying it. So what I want to do here is let's look for action, just like label some actions. I would argue there's one major action going on here and then some minor actions. And if you could say anything about preference, anything about turn construction and turn taking. And we're going to have to do this quickly and do it together. So I'll try to play this so you can hear what it sounds like.
Would you be your country? Would you be willing to receive a memorandum from me? Well, for your general information. Yeah, because I think it might help you. Except there are things you may not want to tell me. No, there's really nothing I don't want to tell you. I would think that.
Play it again.
Would you be your country? Would you be willing to receive a memorandum from me? Well, for your general information. Yeah, because I think it might help you. Except there are things you may not want to tell me. No, there's really nothing I don't want to tell you. I would think that.
So Any ideas about like a main first action?
Or request?
Yeah, so where are you seeing that?
Would you be willing to receive a memorandum from me?
Uh-huh. So here. So the shorthand, would you be willing to receive a memorandum from me? Okay, so there's a, I guess, indirect request. Like another way to say it might be, please receive this memorandum from me. What can you say about, okay, then what's the second pair part to that?
Would it be line 5, the response? Just
Yeah.
like a tentative yes.
Yeah. So there is a response, well, but it starts with well. So here's like how describing the turn construction would be very important. So would you be willing to receive a memorandum? Well, the only, yeah, you know, that, think of yourself, you ask somebody or you request something from somebody and they do that. Well, the only, yeah,
You can see that online. Sorry, I don't know if you can hear me, but you can see that on line 10.
you can see it on line 10 too.
Yeah.
Except, so there's a yes, but here. Yes, but, you know, except something else. So it continues in line 10, but it's already available to us in line 5. You can see there's a, it's not a straightforward yes response. So you can say, this is showing that there's an upcoming dispreferred response because the person doesn't say just straight out yes. There's some trouble, some problem for whatever it is. Yeah. And then he says, yeah, except. And then the person who made the first request adds to it. And he says, because I think it might help you, you know. So he's kind of continuing to add to the request. So you can say that here in line 11, that the person who made the request, they also hear what's going on in line 5. They hear this as a tentative, hedged, dispreferred packaging of the response. So in this sense, this is why we want to say that it's not just our analysis, but it's the analysis of the participants, how they're analyzing one another's talk. Okay, so we're going to have to leave it. Yeah.
Sorry, can you say what's not line 11 again?
Line 11 is the person who made the request. So up here he said, would you be willing to receive a memorandum? And he doesn't get a straight out yes answer. So in line 11, he's giving a reason why the person should accept, because I think it might help you. So I'm saying that line 11 shows that the person who asked the request is hearing that the recipient, Colson, is not anxious to accept the request. It's hard to even say this is really an acceptance. He does say yeah in there, but it's more like, well, yeah, with rising intonation. Yeah, you know. Do you want to go get a cup of coffee? Yeah. Do you want to go get a cup of coffee? Yeah. Well, yeah. That doesn't sound reassuring. And that's what Hunt can hear that too. It's not just us who hears that. All right, it's 11:20, so I will hang around if you want to talk about this or other things and answer questions. I'm available at my office hour tomorrow and also by email if you have questions about stuff. So otherwise, look for the midterm on D2L. I'll also send it by email, but there'll be a place on D2L where the midterm will be and where you submit the midterm at the end of the class time.
John, will you be available if we have questions via email or something?
Oh, yeah, during the exam? Yes.
Yeah.
Thanks. Good question.
So technically, we're not having a Zoom class. We are just,
Yeah.
It will be like a synchronous class. Like you will be there, right?
I'll be sitting by my computer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I do have a question. I don't know if everybody left.
No, everybody didn't leave, but you can ask.
Okay. But yeah, I can stay around. I have a question.
Okay.
Mhm.
Thanks.
Bye.
John. Bye.
Thank you very much.
I have a quick question. So can I go first? Is that okay, Daniela?
Yeah, that's okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's fine.
Yeah, it's really quick. Just asking about my data. So I am not a native speaker, so a lot of words that I mispronounced, there's no self-repair after that or any repair from my partner. So should I correct the spelling in my transcript or just let it be in?
Oh, that's a good question. I would just use standard spelling convention.
Okay.
Unless somebody makes an issue of it. So, what you just said, you called it, what did you say? Not mispronunciation or not correct pronunciation? I forgot how you described it.
Mispronounce, yeah.
Mispronouncing. So this is a very interesting theoretical issue. So, because people pronounce things differently across the language culture. So I'll say certain things and some people hear it as being mispronounced or a strange pronunciation.
Yeah.
And sometimes people will comment on it to me.
Right.
But usually not. So when you're doing this conversation analysis, I would say sometimes it may happen in the interaction that somebody says like, what did you say? Or how did you say that? And if they say that, then you probably want to put in the transcript, like spell it, I don't know, some different way. Because the person said something like, huh? I didn't get what you said, or I don't understand that word, or, but if there's no trouble, then it seems like there's no reason to transcribe it, to spell it in an odd way if there's no trouble.
Okay. Because I think it would be an analytical point when it seems like my partner and I have established a common ground where she just like somehow understand me.
Yeah, I don't think that's unusual. See, so there's a strong feeling about sorry, I'm just gonna stop the recording here.